Johan, so glad to be here with you today and to get to interview you. We're going to be chatting about a biblical perspective on social justice. Before we jump in, would you please just introduce yourself and give us a bit of a background about who you are?
No problem. So, Johan Erasmus, which is a very Afrikaner name. As a matter of fact, it is the Muhammad of Afrikaners. So everybody's called Johan, and I sort of keep myself busy as a pastor of a small church in Pretoria called Dialoog community, and then we also have an NGO called Betereinders, and the Zulu name for Betereinders is Skhokho Sangempela. So what we try to do through this movement is to, on the one hand, foster reconciliation, and on the other hand, try to do some sort of social development type stuff. And we try to invite Afrikaners into that space to be part of the solution in this country. And it takes many forms. On the one hand, we've identified that Afrikaners are annoyed by mainly two things in life. The one is potholes and the other one is land reform. These are the two very sensitive topics. Sure. So we try to play into those spaces. So we fill potholes and we say that we can't wait for government to do that, and we're giving them too much power if we're always asking government to do their job. Sure. Let's just do it ourselves. And then in terms of land reform, we try to connect up and coming emerging black farmers with established commercial farmers and get that mentorship going, and then try and assist some of these up and coming black farmers. So that's what we try to do in that space. But we've got different reconciliation initiatives. Some of it is trying to teach a bunch of Afrikaners Zulu, short little Zulu courses, which is not going very well for my vocabulary. But we take Afrikaners to go play soccer in the township, and we take some of our township friends to go watch a game at Loftus, and all of these little reconciliation events and activities. Yeah. And then, so from a study perspective, I've been very interested in reconciliation and justice and trying to think through those things from a biblical perspective. And Betereinders or Skhokho Sangempela is mainly an outflow of some of that thinking, at least. And we've also been part of many conversations where we try to get black and white people in the room and talk about race and talk about our history and talk about our future. So study-wise, I'm supposed to pursue at least I'm enrolled for a PhD in trying to think what a biblical vision for justice and reconciliation is.
That's awesome.
I can't claim that I'm doing it, but I'm at least enrolled.
You're thinking
I've
about
got the papers to prove that the administrative department at the Northwest University at least know about me.
Good.
But I'm not doing much, I'm afraid.
Oh, that's awesome. That all sounds really exciting. So it makes me more excited to jump into some of our questions. So for a start, how would the Christian notion of social justice differ from a secular notion?
So, I mean, these things are very difficult to unpack, especially because it's been caught up in the culture wars that's coming from America.
Yes.
So you've got a lot of hostility coming from a lot of people in terms of, as a church, we cannot interact with social justice movement, and it is just Marxist and postmodern, and it's sort of a new version of what in apartheid was called the rooi gevaar, the red danger. We were very scared of anything that's communist. And on the other hand, you've got Christians. So on the one hand, they're trying to shun this social justice movement, but maybe the answer is somewhere in between. Now, there are a couple of examples. Let me just put it this way. So when we fight racism historically, we've seen the church leading that movement primarily. So for example, the abolitionist movement was led by predominantly evangelicals. Think of William Wilberforce, think of Frederick Douglass. It was a victory that was celebrated and pushed by the evangelical church in especially England and in the States. And later you had the civil rights movement in America, mainly led by Martin Luther King Jr. In South Africa, Desmond Tutu, and the church played a very, very prominent role in the fight against apartheid. So these anti-racist movements were mainly church-led movements. The third wave, I'm calling it waves of anti-racism, the third wave of anti-racism is what we've seen now in the last couple of years, primarily led by Black Lives Matter. And this is the first time the fight against racism is primarily secular.
Yes.
And there are certain differences in the tone. So for example, in the first movements, if you look at the language that the Frederick Douglass and the William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect used, if you look at the language that Tutu and Martin Luther King Jr. used, it was always, we've got a common humanity. Yeah. We are all made in the image of God, and that spark of divinity is in all. And when we treat people poorly, then we are undermining God's creative genius. When we oppress people, we are insulting God. That was the language that was used continuously. So it was a common humanity approach. I think one of the approaches that we are seeing within the modern secular justice movement is there's a massive stress on a common enemy. You've got this common enemy of whiteness. You've got this common enemy of heteronormativity, of patriarchy, of ableism. And this is because of a little way of seeing reality that one can probably trace back to guys like Herbert Marcuse and some other thinkers that's commonly associated with the Frankfurt School. Now, I'm sorry if this is boring, but just briefly, many thinkers on the left became disillusioned in the middle part of the 20th century with Marxism, economic Marxism. And economic Marxism divided the world into the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. In other words, capital and the workers. And capital is always exploiting the workers. So you've got an oppressor and you've got oppressed people. And instead of using it as an economic theory, you had a lot of these people from the Frankfurt School saying, it works well as a social theory. So now we divide the world into various identities like gender, race, sexuality, religion. And you've got oppressors at top and you've got oppressed at the bottom. And these power dynamics, that is primarily the way in which we see reality. Now, that resulted in people seeing certain people as just enemies and certain people as victims, certain people inherently as perpetrators and victims. And that, I think, explains part of the animosity that exists at the moment. The conversation is not very nuanced, it's not very friendly. And that's at least one of the differences. Let me just stop there, but that's at least one of the differences that you see between a biblical approach to justice and a secular one.
Yes, that's helpful. You were speaking about America, and it sounds like a big source and influence of the social justice movement, even as we know it here in South Africa. So would you say there's something we can learn from the social justice movement as we basically have inherited it, or is there an issue with it?
I think that's my problem. My problem is that we work with these either-or dichotomy. And we either reject it entirely or we accept it entirely. And to me, we can be a little bit more creative with the whole process. So the one thing that has happened that I think is a little bit lazy is that we in South Africa have copy-pasted the justice conversation in America and just applied it here. So for after the George Floyd incident, people were talking about police brutality in South Africa. And I mean, we've got a lot of social issues. I'm not sure police brutality is our issue. I think that is just a little bit lazy, trying to say, yeah, this is our fight as well. I think the one thing that we need to recognize is that when people say that there are certain things in the world, certain institutions, certain people that are oppressors and you have oppressed people at the bottom, although that is very reductionist and to see all of reality through that lens is problematic, it does help to sometimes put on the lens and to see that there are certain systemic things that is not right. And sometimes you need people to tell you to put on those glasses to see it. So in the South African context, for example, when you go to many restaurants, it's somewhat better in Joburg, but if you go to places like Pretoria, you mainly have black people serving white people. And it sometimes helps to put on the lens when you, and see those things, because maybe sometimes we don't know the water that we swim in, and we are ambiguous or ambivalent rather to many of these issues. I think some of the other things is that as an Afrikaner, I've noticed that it's very easy for me to call or to address elderly white people as and tannie as a form of respect. But from early childhood, I've called my domestic worker, who is a tannie, I've called her on her first name. So why do I have respect on this hand, but not necessarily here? And then I think some of the other issues that I've been convicted of is the fact that, I remember going to Europe for the first time and seeing a young, attractive white girl on all fours cleaning the floor. And for me,
it was a shock.
It was a shock. I haven't. Now, why is it a shock? Why is it problematic that a white person is not supposed to do that? That reveals that there are some issues, and maybe there are certain systemic issues. Probably the best example is that the plasters that you buy in a shop more resembles my skin tone than your skin tone. It's starting to change now, but that does say that there is a certain normativity to whiteness, a certain assumption that whiteness is normal, and the alternative to that is black, for example. Another very problematic word that I was taught as a young kid is when I used to color. I wasn't very good, but when I used to color in the nursery school, then I would ask for a particular crayon called skin color or menskleur. So why is the one called skin color and the other one called brown? Black, Is that not the color of skin? In Afrikaans, it's even more problematic because we say it's human color. So imagine just being the opposite of human color, then you are black or brown. So these things are problematic, and I think it came to light in this very heightened social justice movement that we've seen. Where it becomes problematic is if you look at reality with the lens that white people are continuously trying to oppress black people, they are continuously trying to preserve white power. When you look at that reality through that lens, then the smallest interaction will be met with this massive hermeneutic of suspicion. Our conversation will constantly be through the lens of, how is this guy trying to undermine me? How is this guy being racist? So one of the what they call critical race educators is a lady called Robin DiAngelo. And she says the question is not if racism took place in a given interaction between black and white, it is how racism took place in a given interaction. So the question is not if I was racist to you right now, the question is how was I racist? And your job is to try and figure out how I was racist. Now you can imagine that is not, that does not necessarily allow for winsome conversations, believing the best. Love always believes the best. That is the opposite of that. So there for me is an example where one can see there are benefits of the modern day social justice movement, and they've highlighted certain social fault lines that we haven't picked up. But on the other hand, it becomes just a little bit toxic when every conversation is met with so much suspicion and hostility.
Yes. So I guess then the question would be, what could the church do, and especially the church here in South Africa, I suppose, do to influence the conversation and the movement of social justice, especially with regard to truth, reconciliation, and really caring for one's neighbor as yourself?
I think so much. The one thing that we should never forget is that South Africa is a bit of a miracle. And nobody likes the language of the Rainbow Nation. I mean, I still like it, but it's become...
We're disillusioned.
People have become disillusioned and they don't buy that anymore. But the fact that South Africa had a peaceful transition in 1994 is nothing short of a miracle. I mean, nowhere in history do you have power that is so central here, just being given over to power on this side without blood being spilled.
War.
That is unheard of. And one of the central players in that was a guy like Desmond Tutu and his Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And a guy like Desmond Tutu spoke about forgiveness. He said there's no future without forgiveness. And Nelson Mandela came and he spoke about forgiveness. Today, you've got many activists throwing guys like Tutu and Mandela under the bus and saying they were sellouts, etc. But forgiveness is so crucial when you try to foster a community, when you try to build a new society. And unfortunately, there is what many people call a fading of forgiveness. So for example, the other day in the US, there was a shooting, they call it the Charleston Massacre, where a right-wing Nazi kid, Dylan Booth, went into a black church. He had a cell group with them, he had Bible study with them, and afterwards opened fire on all of them, killing them. And it was atrocious, as you can imagine. And the very next day, the family of these members who were killed in the church, they expressed remorse. They were broken beyond imagination. But then they still expressed forgiveness towards this guy. And those family members are praying for Dylan Booth and trying to connect with him in jail, even though I don't think he is interested in it. And what was interesting is that instead of celebrating this wonderful act of forgiveness, I mean, it's just a testimony of the Holy Spirit living within those people. Many black Americans and others just rejected it out of hand and saying that we need to stop this forgiveness tirade and it's just a sham and we need to stop this nonsense. So there is a very strong sense of us moving away from where we used to celebrate forgiveness, where we just want justice at the moment. The problem, however, with justice is that justice means giving each his due. I'm now quoting from a British missiologist called Leslie Newbigin. Justice means giving each his due. But our problem, as seen in light of the gospel, is that we all overestimate what is due him versus what is due his neighbor. And then he goes on and he says, if we do not have a justice which judges our justice, then we become not agents of peace, but agents of lawless tyranny. And that is where, again, the biblical perspective on justice, I think, is radically different from secular alternatives. In the sense that when you look at when you look at someone and you look at a situation and you look at an injustice, you know that injustice is not just somewhere out there, it is in here as well. Humans are broken. And that doesn't mean that you cannot call out injustice where it happens in society or in relationships, etc. But you come to that conversation with a lot of humility. You come to that conversation from a place where you know that you are broken as well. So for example, in the Gospels, you've got this wonderful narrative that is taking place at the end of Luke 12 and the beginning of Luke 13, where Jesus seems to be speaking about reconciliation and trying to settle with your accuser along the way. And I think it's quite clear that the background there is the ongoing hostility between the Jews and the Romans. So he's saying, don't preach this nationalist rhetoric, this revolution rhetoric. You need to settle with your accuser along the way. And then as he is saying that, his Jewish audience interrupts him and they say, oh Jesus, have you heard what Pontius Pilate did to those Galatians who were going to the temple? He mixed their blood with those of the sacrifices. So what are they doing? They are hearing Jesus is talking reconciliation nonsense. So they are saying, oh Jesus, you're from Galilee, right? Did you hear what the Roman person here, Pontius Pilate, did to our people? he mixed it with those of the sacrifices. And then Jesus doesn't flinch. He says, do you think they were bigger sinners than you? Let me tell you, unless you repent, the same will happen to you as well. So in other words, Jesus is not buying this nationalistic rhetoric that we need to fight, that we need justice. He's saying, you need to reconcile. You need to settle with him before you go to the courts. And that is what happened in South Africa. There was a settlement. People spoke. You had the Tutus and the Mandelas and the Rolf Meyers and all of these people having a conversation and trying to settle on the way. And people compromised on justice. And that is always a good justice, by the way, when you talk about big racial justice. It is something that both sides must be unhappy with. And that's something that we had in South Africa. Both sides were very unhappy about the justice that they got. But they settled along the way, and we didn't have a violent revolution here in South Africa. And thank God for that. At the moment, a lot of people are, calling for blood, and they sort of want a war that they were denied in the 90s. But I mean, that's just a silly way of thinking. I think South Africa is a wonderful example of what happens when people talk and they settle with their accuser along the way. And therefore, we need to owe the Ramaphosas and especially the Tutus and the Frank Shikanis a lot of thanks for trying to pave a way towards reconciliation.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying, especially with regard to, I guess, what we see as justice versus what's maybe contained in Scripture, it does remind me of what we see in Matthew as well, after the Beatitudes, where Jesus talks about the Pharisees of the day and how they interpreted an eye for an eye, and sort of how he breaks that down in terms of interpersonal relationships, not disregarding it on a national sort of scale. You need law and justice, and you need a criminal system.
Says the lawyer.
Yeah, of course. But just in terms of having that mentality, in terms of interpersonal relations, it's quite unloving, ultimately, to put your own justice before reconciliation, really.
Well, there is no justice to be had without forgiveness.
Sure.
So what I mean by that is that what you call justice will just be another word for revenge.
Correct.
And the cycle will just continue. So for example, the Afrikaners were convinced that they were building a just society, but they were so hurt from the pain that they experienced under the English that they didn't realize that they have become the perpetrators. They've become the oppressors in apartheid South Africa. But they were so convinced that they are being victimized by the English colonialism that it never occurred to them that they are the perpetrators. Sure. So what happens now in South Africa? You have a lot of black victims suffering under apartheid. And if that is the only way in which you see reality, that you are a victim, you are not very open to the fact that you are in fact a perpetrator once you have power. Sure. So to be blinded by your own justice is very dangerous.
Yes.
The Bible, I think, gives us a lot of tools in terms of trying to figure out what a biblical justice is. And by the way, I don't think it's easy to figure out what a biblical justice is. When somebody comes and says, let me tell you what a biblical justice is, you must be very careful when they do that. But I think we can see certain characteristics of a biblical justice. On the one hand, it starts by identifying my enemy as a fellow sinner and somebody who's made in the image of God. So you need to identify him in his sin and in his humanity, and you need to identify yourself in your sin and in your humanity. That makes the conversation come from a humble and sober place, I think. I think the other thing that a biblical justice wants is, in the end, there must be a will to embrace. In other words, you must want reconciliation in the end. And this is incredibly difficult because there are a lot of atrocities happening around the world. But eventually that must be our posture. It mustn't be, the end game of a justice cannot be exclusion. that won't be justice. There must be this approach, this willingness to embrace. These are some of the characteristics I think should be prevalent in when we are trying to go towards a more just society.
Yeah. So, as Christians then, and as the church, how do we empathize, really? How do we understand and share the feelings of other people without slipping into the dangers of simply jumping into the social justice movement as it is? What are the nuances there? And
so that word of empathy and trying to understand where victims are coming from has been somewhat militarized in the modern social justice movement. What I mean by that is there is a massive suspicion towards anything labeled as truth in your contemporary social justice movement, because they would say, no, that's just whiteness, patriarchy trying to preserve their power. So you're very suspicious about truth. So epistemology, which is our theory of truth, becomes very postmodern. And the only way in which people in this new way of thinking, the only way in which we can access truth is if you are a victim. If you are marginalized, then you've got access to truth. And that's why the buzzword is lived experience. That is not my lived experience, or you cannot understand my lived experience. And it becomes very difficult to have a conversation then, because as a white male, I cannot access your lived experience. Now, a couple of things happens. If victimhood is the only way in which we can have a conversation with each other, don't be surprised that I am going to try
shy away, but also present myself as a victim, which is happening. The right wing in South Africa is constantly trying to tell the world, we are being victimized, we are being victimized. And Afrikaners are convinced that, affirmative action, and there are so many ways in which we are being victimized. Why? Because the only way that you can get empathy in this world is if you can prove that you are a victim. That's why I say that we've become a country of soccer players, where we are just diving all the time and saying, there was an infringement, give me a penalty, give me a penalty. And that doesn't make for good viewing, right? So we must be careful of this militarization of empathy. And again, that comes from an American context where I don't want to trivialize their issues, but Black America is one of the richest groups in the world. If you just take them and compare them to Africa and compare them to the rest of the world. But I think empathy in a South African context is to really be moved by poverty. And that's what we also try to tell our white friends in our Betereinders movement, is come and visit us in the township. Because there is some truth to lived experience. Sure.
We must learn from these people. We must understand it. What I find annoying is the majority of the time when people talk about lived experience, it is either these Americans sitting at Harvard University talking about their lived experience, and somehow I'm not very sympathetic, or in the South African context, it's these very rich, well-educated people at our university institutions talking about how they are being oppressed, when in South Africa, it's blatantly obvious that there are so many people who are poor and who are being oppressed. And I don't think you and I should try and vie for who's the most oppressed. I'm sorry if that is offensive. That's at least my thinking. But we need to also understand that this obsession with the oppressed comes from Christianity. In the ancient world, nobody said, I'm oppressed. If you claimed that you were oppressed in the ancient world, they would have laughed at you. You said, yeah, that's because you're useless. But in Christianity, oppression became meaningful because Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said, blessed are those who suffer and who are persecuted. So that's why although I'm very skeptical about this militarization of victimhood, there is something helpful, and that is when you are experiencing suffering, when you are going through something, you do have, it seems, spiritual access that people who are comfortable do not have. So that is why I think it is sometimes helpful to try and empathize and learn from people who are being oppressed. Because Jesus seems to think that if you are very dependent and you are very vulnerable, then you know something about God that I don't, because I'm not worrying about what I'm going to eat tomorrow. So I hope you understand that you can't have this copy-paste thing and saying, this whole thing about empathy is just nonsense, lived experience is just nonsense, we can reject that out of hand. That is what I think the right wing of the culture wars in America would like you to believe. I think there is some truth to it. I'm a little bit skeptical when it is this super flashy, let's say black, lesbian, rich, eloquent scholar trying to convince me that that I need to have empathy with her because she's being victimized. But in South Africa, there are a lot of people, mostly black, that I think we can learn from.
Sure.
And empathize with.
Sure. So let's go to your practical experiences. What are some things that you've done in your ministry that you see as having facilitated hope and change?
Look, I mean, let me start off by saying that I suck at it. I'm not very good at, I think I talk a good game, but getting it down to practice is difficult. But at least we've had a couple of attempts. So on the one hand, when we try to facilitate discussions, especially where there's racial animosity, me and a friend of mine, Trevor and Tlola, will often go into places where there's a bit of a breakdown in trust, and we will try and see if we can foster reconciliation there. The biblical approach that we typically use is to start off by saying, where are you the problem? And the white kids would be convinced that they are being marginalized in a particular scenario, and the black kids will be convinced. And then instead of just talking about this victimhood narrative, we say, where are you the perpetrator? And I think this is super valuable because, there's this famous line by G.K. Chesterton. He was this British journalist, and he was asked at the turn of the 20th century to write what is wrong with the world.
Yes.
And he just wrote a very short essay to the newspaper saying, "Dear Mr. Editor, regarding your question, what's wrong with the world, I am, sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." So in this world, in this country, everybody's convinced that if we can just get rid of patriarchy, if we can just get rid of whiteness, if we can just get rid of the ANC, if we can just get rid of these guys, then everything will be okay. But a Christian says, no, I am part of the problem, so I need to start with myself. So in our racial facilitation conversations that we do, we try to start with that and try and get people to be humble as we go into this space. That doesn't mean that there's no injustice. It just means that you need to know that more often than not, you are part of an injustice. And I think that's a wonderful view that the Christian worldview gives us, a wonderful perspective, rather. Some of the other things, I think we said it in the beginning, is that I sometimes find it so annoying that when people talk about social justice, it just becomes a talk shop.
Yeah.
And nobody's doing anything. And if we are not moving our bodies to where poor people are, then we can talk all about social justice and nothing is going to change. I'm sorry, but to just have a rainbow flag, on your social media, or just have BLM on your social media, that is not justice in my mind.
Sure.
We need to be moved to the poor. I spoke a little bit about the abolitionist movement that was led by the church, but some other books that's just so meaningful is to just see how the Christian Revolution really brought about social justice in this world. Read about the Cappadocian fathers, Gregory and Basil of Nyssa, and their sister Macrina. They stopped infanticide. So in other words, in the Greco-Roman world, they were just tossing babies on rubbish dumps. These people started what we call today orphanages or monasteries where these kids were taken. The gladiatorial games were stopped because of Christians saying this is nonsense. You had hospital systems being built by Christians. We need to get on board with that and get excited about that. When the Ebola virus broke out a couple of years ago in West Africa, there were a couple of whiteys who also got the Ebola virus, and they got a bit of attention. Who are they? And they wanted to get back in America, and Trump at that stage said, no, don't let them in. Who were they? They were people from the Samaritan Purse, medical missionary doctors, as a matter of fact, led by Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, trying to bring medical justice to a place that is very affected by it. That sort of bravery that we see is something that we need to reclaim. And in our small way, at Betereinders, I guess we try to do that. We try to say, first of all, that Afrikaners are part of the problem in this country. And what we've often done that's not very popular is I'll invite some of my black friends and they can just share their experiences of Afrikaners and what's happened. So we say, yes, we need to do justice out there, but before we do that, we have to have a look inside and just see how we are problematic, because you can cause a lot of damage by trying to help people as well. So we start off by doing that, but then we say this cannot just be a talk shop. We cannot just deconstruct whiteness all day and whatever that means. We need to go out and we need to share our privilege. And in our case, it is mainly trying to convince white Afrikaners to do that. But I'll say the same to you. You need to share your privilege. If you are middle class in South Africa, you've got a responsibility towards the poor around you.
Sure. So maybe as a parting message, what is your encouragement to the church then? What would you like to say as the point?
Okay. Well, I'm sorry that I wasn't articulate enough
throughout
the...
It's a summary.
Articulate enough throughout the talk to give across that one point. But I'll give it a shot. So there's a lot of noise out there. You've got YouTube and you've got all of these activist groups trying to win you over for their cause. At the moment, there's a big backlash, and you've got these American guys who are very articulate and maybe well worth listening to, like a Ben Shapiro and a Jordan Peterson and all of these chaps. And it's tempting to think that as a Christian, that is my camp. That is where I need to be. In the beginning, when Black Lives Matter and all of these movements just started to flare up, many Christians just uncritically swallowed that and got on that bandwagon. No, I don't think we need to be on either bandwagon to now just dismiss critical race theory and say that this is a load of bollocks and it's just Marxist, postmodernist, satanic, antichrist stuff. That is not helping. Likewise, to just swallow it and say, you know what, whites, we need to atone for our sins completely, and we need to attest of my privilege, and sorry for all the 50 microaggressions that I just did here in our little conversation. That is also just a little bit pathetic, and I think we can dismiss that. But the hard work of the Christian, I think, the hard work of the church today is to say, what is true in what is being said on the left? What are true in what is being said from the right in terms of its criticism? And then we have to navigate in the space between. What I find so annoying is that, again, this is an American conversation, but that American republicanism equals Christianity. And the other day, here in South Africa, I saw that just copy-pasted when somebody said, how must a Christian vote? And then they gave the 10 points that Christians should be concerned about when they go to the ballot. And they said, what's your view on abortion? Okay, fair enough. I think a Christian should have an opinion about that. You know what was the second thing? Gun control. You should have a gun. Okay. The third thing that and then they take all the parties and they say who's for it, and then they had the ACDP and the Freedom Front, who looks very Christian because they're for guns. Who's for the death penalty? Who's against this climate change? That is the Christian position. Are you kidding me? To be against opportunity or movements to try and manage climate change, that is the Christian position. That is just lazy. As a Christian, I can say, abortion is problematic. As a Christian, I can say, you know what, we need to take care of the environment, and there are some very good scientists telling us that we're in trouble, so we need to do something about it, even if Christians say it's myth or nonsense like that. Likewise, I can say, since when is having a gun synonymous with being a Christian?
Even relevant, though.
What are we even talking about? And then the death penalty. Why are these Christians so excited about the death penalty? Now, I'm not trying to say that these issues are easy. I'm just saying that if you are just going to choose one of these sides in an attempt to either be a woke Christian or be a nice, good old conservative Christian, you are going to miss the hard work of navigating between the lines and saying, I agree with this, I reject this. I agree with this, I reject this. Or sometimes this is somewhat good, I'm going to try and redeem it by saying the following. And I hope I didn't butcher that, but that is my hope, to say that we need to think hard about what is a biblical justice. We shouldn't be lazy. We shouldn't just copy paste what is out there, and that's where the beauty is. Jesus also didn't fit into existing categories
Particular
when
box.
it came to justice as well. Was he for Roman oppression? No. Was he for Jewish nationalism? No.
Sure. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Johan. I really appreciate this conversation. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate it.